In a weathered old wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the Appalachian forest, Mr. Allister, a retired botanist, lived a quiet life alongside two four-legged companions, Marmalade and Sooty. Marmalade was a lazy golden tabby who loved curling up in the sun and purred like a soft motor whenever stroked. Sooty was different, a black cat with graceful steps and wide green eyes that always seemed to silently observe the world. That morning, as mist still lingered on the leaves, Mr. Proscratter, Allister noticed an unfamiliar silhouette outside the glass door. A bobcat, silent and surreal as if it had stepped out from a wild dream, sat motionless with its eyes fixed on the warmth inside the room. Each morning, the Appalachian forest lay cloaked in mist, hiding something quietly shifting between stillness and instinct. In a weathered wooden cabin at the edge of the woods, Mr. Allister, a retired botanist, lived a quiet life with two feline companions, Marmalade, an orange tabby who loved to nap in sunlight, and Sooty, a black cat with sharp green eyes who often watched the world in silence. One morning, as mist still lingered on the window pane, Mr. Allister noticed a visitor outside. Not a person, not a pet. A wild bobcat, fur speckled like snow-covered bark, ears tipped in black, was sitting motionless. It didn't growl or scratch. It simply raised one paw and touched the glass, as if sending a message no one could yet understand. From that day on, it returned each morning, silent and still, like a ritual. While the mist hung low, the bobcat stared inside where Marmalade curled in a chair, and Sooty remained watchful, unmoved. Mr. Allister began greeting it with soft words. "Good morning, little silent one," he whispered. Over time, he named it Whisper. Whisper never begged, never sought food. It just sat, observed, and sometimes rested on the mat outside the door where the first sunbeam reached. Occasionally, Marmalade would sniff the glass, and Whisper would do the same, their noses separated only by a pane. No one knew why the bobcat came. But that door of glass, once a barrier, became something else, a fragile thread between wild and domestic, between forest and hearth. And in that shared silence, something subtle began to shift, not only in Whisper, but in the two house cats, and in Mr. Allister himself. As the last leaves of the Appalachian trees fell, and the cold wind began slipping through every crack in the wooden cabin, whispering of winter's approach. Whisper still came each morning, thinner now, her fur rougher, her eyes deeper. Yet despite the weariness in her body, her gaze remained unchanged, quiet, patient, never asking, always watching. Mr. Allister began to notice something new. Some mornings, the dew around the doormat showed the soft print of round paws. Sometimes, she didn't stand but curled tightly on the threshold, as if waiting for something to cross the line between outside and in. Marmalade still sat faithfully by the glass. Ears perked the moment Whisper appeared. Sooty, once more cautious, now stood beside Mr. Allister, watching with him, as though together they listened to a language humans could never speak. Then, one late autumn afternoon, as the wind howled through the roof seams, bringing the musty scent of forest earth, Whisper arrived earlier than usual. She didn't stand. She didn't touch the glass. She simply sat, her eyes softer, her posture weaker but still calm. Mr. Allister stood silently by the door, his hand resting on the latch. It wasn't fear that held him. It was instinct, that deeply human hesitation in the presence of the wild. But just like that first morning when he had whispered good morning through the glass, this time he chose to trust something deeper than instinct. He opened the door gently. Cold air swept into the room, carrying the rustle of leaves. Whisper raised her head. Her eyes met his. Then, without fear, she stood. Her walk was slow, steady, as if enacting a sacred ritual. Marmalade was the first to step out. The orange cat didn't hurry. He moved carefully, his back slightly arched, in quiet respect. Whisper lowered her head even further, gently nudging her nose forward. A soft touch so brief, yet it stole Mr. Allister's breath. Sooty followed, not with caution this time, but with the grace of someone doing something utterly ordinary. Three noses met in silence. No growls, no flinches, no fear. Just the quiet gestures of a ritual that defied species, instinct, and history. Mr. Allister stood behind them, not as a master, but as a witness to something sacred. There was no wall collapsing, no miracle to proclaim, but in that simple touch of noses, he felt it a moment of acceptance. An invisible thread now tied the three creatures together. And for the first time, Whisper had truly crossed the line. November mornings slowed down, their sunlight no longer sharp, but angled and faint, falling gently across the moss-covered wooden porch. As always, Mr. Allister pulled back the thin curtain by the kitchen window, a steaming cup of tea in hand. And like a ritual long formed over the past weeks, Whisper appeared again. She no longer moved with hesitation. She now walked calmly from the tree line, crossing the faded grass and stepping onto the stone tiles of the patio. She didn't peer inside immediately. Instead, she paused, lifted her head, and took a deep breath of old wood, weak sunlight, and the quiet scent of home confirming, perhaps, that this place was still safe. Marmalade was already waiting. The orange cat always woke before anyone else in the house. When he saw Whisper, he trotted over, no longer shy, no longer meowing greetings like in the early days. Between the two, there was only silence now, the kind of silence that settles between old friends who need no words. Sudi, more regal and cautious, often arrived last. She would walk out slowly, pausing beside Mr. Allister before leaping onto the porch. But in time, she too would settle beside Marmalade, her tail curled neatly around her, head slightly tilted, watching Whisper not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity of someone trying to understand. Whisper often lay in a sunny corner near the edge of the old thick rug. Once, she curled up there and fell asleep. Her spotted gray fur shimmered in the pale light, ears twitching slightly at every sound carried by the wind. Sudi lay nearby, grooming Marmalade from time to time. No one disturbed anyone, yet all of them knew exactly where the others were. Mr. Allister never stepped onto the patio during those moments. He knew that world wasn't his, even if it was only a few steps away. He often stood behind the glass, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, watching as if attending a rare play in which he was the sole audience. Not because he feared breaking the moment, but because he understood that Whisper's presence was a gift, and gifts should never be demanded. Once, he brought out his old film camera, the kind he hadn't used in years. He didn't take any pictures. He simply held it, then set it down. Some things, he thought, couldn't be captured in a frame, like the warmth of three small bodies lying near one another in winter light, like the wind brushing against the porch and the soft breathing of different species sharing rest. These were moments to be stored in the heart. In the days that followed, Whisper came more often. Some days she merely sat. On others, she napped until late afternoon, but not once did she cross the threshold into the house. Mr. Allister never called her in, not because he lacked courage, but because he understood. Friendship did not require the erasing of all boundaries. Being welcomed at the door was already deep enough. On the first night snow fell, the Appalachian forest turned eerily silent. Every branch trembled in the darkness, dusted in a fine white mist like frozen breath. Mr. Allister's cabin sank into the hush of cold, the only warmth remaining in the soft glow of the fireplace. He sat in his familiar armchair, a thick woolen shawl draped across his knees. Marmalade lay stretched out on the rug, paws tucked beneath him, tail flicking softly to the crackle of burning wood. Sudi curled in her cushioned basket, ears alert, still guarding something unseen in the stillness of winter, near midnight, just as Mr. Prosser. Allister rose to shut the window. A gray figure emerged, soft as fog, but unmistakable. He froze. Whisper. The bobcat stood at the edge of the patio, her back lightly dusted with snow. Her eyes no longer shimmered with curiosity, but with exhaustion. Her fur was wet, her paws caked with frozen earth. her body thinner than before. She didn't cry, didn't press her paw against the glass as she used to. She simply sat down, then curled into herself on the doormat in the middle of the snow-washed dark. Mr. Allister's heart tightened. He didn't speak. He simply stood, then slowly opened the door. For the first time, there was no barrier, no glass, no divide. The cold air rushed in, biting his skin. But he didn't step back. He gently laid down a thick, old but clean blanket beside the fire, in the one place still glowing with warmth. Then he returned inside, not waiting for Whisper to enter, not urging her to do so. But the next morning, when pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, he saw her. Whisper was sleeping. Not outside, not on the porch, but right on the rug before the fireplace. Marmalade nestled close to her right, one paw resting gently across her back. Sooty had curled to her left, her tail wrapped around herself, ear just brushing Whisper's shoulder. Three beings, wild, tame, and human, now rested side by side, as if they had shared this life from the very beginning. Mr. Allister didn't wake them. He didn't reach for a camera. He simply sat, hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold, eyes fixed on the quiet miracle before him, a small fire still burning, and three tiny hearts breathing in sync through the coldest winter. In that moment, he understood. Some doors, once opened by trust, never need closing again. And some distances, no matter how deeply rooted in wild instinct, can be bridged by warmth. Whisper was no longer a guest. She had chosen to stay. Not through invitation, not by leash or command. Just by the presence of a warm rug, a crackling fire, and two friends who asked for nothing, and that alone was enough to call this place home. Winter faded like a long, dreamless sleep, leaving the Appalachian forest steeped in thin mist and the scent of damp earth. Ice cracked beneath the hooves of passing deer, and shrubs quietly sprouted green buds, as if nature itself were whispering its own rebirth. Mr. Allister marked the first day of spring by flinging open the kitchen window, letting the early breeze breathe through the cabin that had been sealed for so many months. But there was something he didn't say aloud. He opened the window to wait for someone. Whisper had not returned. Not in the first week. Not in the second. The rug by the door remained, still holding the last traces of fur she left behind. But the patch of earth in front of the porchance, patterned with careful feline steps now, held only dry leaves and smudges of mud from the previous night's rain. Mr. Allister sat by the window, brewing tea in the morning, feeding the fire at night. Sometimes, he wasn't sure whether he was waiting for a bobcat or simply resisting a quiet ache that grew larger with each passing day. Marmalade and Sooty had changed too. They no longer played or chased strings. They often lay silently by the windowsill, eyes on the empty yard, ears twitching at the slightest sound in the woods. Somehow, they knew too that the familiar presence that had once changed their home was no longer there. There was no roar, no sign of injury, no trail of paw prints leading away. Whisper had disappeared as quietly as she came. No one knew when she left, or why. But it was that very silence that pained Mr. Allister the most. One morning, while sweeping the porch, he froze upon finding a single gray hair caught in the edge of the doorframe, small, weightless. But it really hurt. He didn't cry, but when he placed a wild daisy stem into the glass jar on the windowsill, his hand trembled. On the final snowy night, he laid out the old blanket by the fire again, not out of ritual, but with a silent hope that Whisper might return, curl between her old friends, and sleep. But the next morning, only Marmalade and Sooty remained. No new tracks, and no one knocked on the door anymore. Whisper, the bobcat of winter days, now lived only in memoria, slow, wordless song that once played so close and then quietly disappeared into the wilderness. Yet Mr. Allister never closed that door. Every morning, he still poured tea into 3 cups, one for himself, one for Marmalade and Sooty, and one kept warm for Whisper on the chance that one day those soft steps might return, light as mist, but enough to make the whole house breathe again. It was a morning, bathed in sunlight, The light filtered through thin layers of clouds, breaking into warm golden streaks that scattered across the backyard of the wooden house. Mr. Alistair was watering the newly sprouted heather buds when Marmalade suddenly froze on the patio, ears erect, eyes fixed toward the edge of the forest. Sudi darted forward like an aeronaut out of fear, but as if responding to a signal she deeply recognized. And then he saw her, whisper, thinner. Her steps are slower. Her fur was dusty and her eyes lined with fatigue from months of wandering. But that gaze, calm, gentle, was still the same one Mr. Alistair had never forgotten. What stunned him, however, was not her return. It was the fact that Whisper did not come alone. Behind her, cautious but unafraid, were two bobcat cubs, one with pale gray fur, small ears, and wide, bewildered eyes. The other, slightly smaller, clung close to its mother's legs, as if the world was still far too vast to comprehend. They stopped at the edge of the yard. Whisper took a few more steps, then turned back as if to signal them forward. The two cubs crept ahead, pausing every few paces to look up, to listen. No one spoke a word. Even the wind seemed to quiet itself. Mr. Alistair lowered the watering can. Marmalade walked slowly across the yard, calm and welcoming. Sudi followed, brushing against Whisper's side like an old greeting. No meows, no collisions, just glances, gentle nose touches. A reunion ceremony that needed no words. Whisper moved to the familiar rug on the porch and sat down, breathing slowly. Then, in a moment that seemed pulled from memory, she leaned forward and gently pressed her forehead to Marmalade's. The two cubs sat close together, watching the scene unfold, not yet understanding that this place had now become part of their story too. Mr. Alistair stood there for a long while. What swelled in his chest wasn't quite joy, but something deeper. A quiet, profound gratitude. Grateful that Whisper had survived. Grateful she had returned. Grateful that she had chosen this home not just as a refuge from winter, but as the first place she would bring her children. As the sun climbed higher, the three cats Marmalade, Sudi, and Whisper lay sunbathing on the porch, their tails gently touching in a closed circle. The cubs nestled into their mother's back and drifted into sleep, utterly at ease. In that moment, Mr. Alistair whispered, perhaps only to himself, "No one's a stranger anymore." And truly, at that moment, there were no longer any borders between the forest and the house, between the wild and the familiar only kindred spirits, once lost, now found. One morning, Mr. Alistair awoke to the faint sound of scratching at the patio door. When he pulled the curtain aside, the sight that met his eyes made his heart pause for a few seconds. Marmalade was gently licking the head of one of the bobcat cubs. It wasn't the curious or territorial licking that cats sometimes do. It was deliberate, careful, tender-like, an older sibling soothing a sleepy child. Sudi, who rarely showed affection, did not stay away either. She stepped closer to the other cub, touched her nose gently to its forehead, then brushed her cheek against it as if to say, "You're safe now." Whisper lay nearby, not intervening, not directing. She simply watched. Her gaze no longer held the wary look of one who had lived a solitary life. It was the look of gratitude and quiet relief, like a mother who had weathered a storm and finally found a place she could almost call home. Mr. Alistair didn't go outside right away. He simply sat quietly in his chair, a cup of tea in his hands, watching through the glass. The morning sun bathed the dappled gray fur of the wild visitors, turning the entire scene into something that looked like a living painting. From that day on, the household subtly adjusted to the presence of its new members. He placed an extra water dish by the patio. Marmalade began sharing his favorite sleeping corner. Sudi, though easily irritable, no longer hissed when the cubs batted at her tail. No one taught them to do this. No one forced it. It simply happened because their hearts had opened. Whisper still kept a certain distance from Mr. Alistair. She never entered the house, never touched his hand. But each time he appeared at the steps, she would raise her head and blink slowly, in action only cats who truly trust will make. And he would blink back, just as slowly, a silent promise. We will not harm your children. Occasionally, he would catch Whisper watching her cubs play with Marmalade, then glance towards Sooty, curled in the sun. And in that slight tilt of her head, he could read one thing: peace of mind. Whisper hadn't come here to beg for food or out of weakness. She had come because she had chosen this place to give her cubs a chance to grow up without fear. And so, the old wooden house on the edge of the Appalachian forest, once home to only an old man and two cats, had become a sanctuary for 5 souls, 3 species, sharing a single rhythm, the rhythm of trust. The days that followed passed in a quiet kind of tenderness. Whisper and her 2 cubs never stepped deep into the house. They never climbed onto the chairs or leapt onto the windowsill like Marmalade and Sooty. They came only to the porch each morning, lying still in the sunlight or curling up on the old mat by the door as if they had belonged to this place for a very long time. No one taught them the schedule, yet they arrived with the same rhythm each day, as though the forest itself had adjusted its time to match Mr. Allister's gentle life. He never tried to call them closer. He never expressed ownership. Each time he set out a fresh bowl of water or scattered a few pieces of roasted chicken near the steps, he did so with a quiet reverence, like serving tea to cherished guests, not feeding wild animals. Whisper never growled, never rubbed against his hand like Marmalade often did. But sometimes, while he watered the garden, she would step silently near him. Not too close, just enough for their worlds to touch without a sound. One morning, after all the snow had melted and the scent of pine resin floated through the air, Mr. Allister was writing in his journal when Whisper came close to the window. She didn't place a paw on the glass like she had that first time. She just stood there, looking in, looking for a very long time. Her eyes held no more caution, no more fear, only a calm gaze that seemed to say, "We're all right now. And so are you." He gave a soft nod, unsure whether it was meant for her or for himself. From that day on, Whisper would occasionally vanish for a few days. Perhaps she was teaching the cubs to hunt field mice, or leading them deeper into the valley where moonlight touched the stone lake. But always, without fail, she returned. No one knew how long they would stay. No one had the right to decide. Mr. Allister understood. Well, he had not tamed the wild. He had not turned the forest into a home. He had not changed those spirits born of untamed earth. He had only been chosen by nature itself to hold a small space between 2 worlds. A place where people made no demands, where the wild needed no defense, and where moments of peace could exist, simple and whole. A place built by no one. A porch claimed by no one. A home not possessed, but chosen. And in Whisper's final glance, standing beneath the golden light of sunset cast across the wooden floorboards, Mr. Allister knew this truth. The most precious things in life are never meant to be held, they are meant to be honored.